Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your patience. My name is Raheem Thompson. I am the manager of public programs. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, and the entire museum, I would like to thank you all for joining us for tonight's book and author program, Ferris, a Memoir by Meredith Talusan. And this is part of our Rise Up exhibition. We started in October, and each program presented a different story, a different challenge, anything that we needed to overcome in supporting the LGBTQ plus movement. And tonight will be another addition to our Rise Up exhibition. I would like to bring on Meredith, who will also share a presentation, and then we will get into some questions. So if you have any questions, please submit them into the Q&A function, and we will get to as many as we can. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you so much to the Illinois Holocaust Museum for inviting me to speak to you today. And I only wish that that I were there in person, but unfortunately we're living in the times that we're living in. So I wrote a memoir called Fairest, which is about my journey from being a rural albino child in the Philippines who was queer and to America and to an undergraduate degree and becoming part of being inculcated into the American elite by being recruited as an undergraduate on scholarship at Harvard, where I explored my gender and sexuality, and I ended up transitioning shortly after college. And what I wanted to do at the beginning, I have just a little bit of a slideshow with some pictures from my life, but I wanted to start with just a couple of paragraphs from the first chapter of Fairest, just in order for people who haven't read the book to kind of have a sense of my existence and my life as a young child. So this is from chapter 1. Among my people, it is a widely held belief that an infant would become whatever its mother had craved. Sugar and a child would turn out sweet, for instance, or plantains and the baby would grow sturdy. Pregnant women were therefore advised not to spend too much time in the sun and certainly not to stare at it directly for fear that their baby would be born anak araw, a sun child, the strangest creature whose skin was so pale it glowed, and who couldn't open its eyes except to squint, destined to be nearly blind, an affront against nature. Yet on the long bus ride from my parents' house in Manila to my hometown of Talaksan in the province of Bulacan, my grandmother Nanay Coro told me that as soon as she held me in her arms, she was sure I was a blessing. She refused to allow anyone to talk about me any other way, especially because I was destined to live in America, the richest of countries, where Mama's father, Lola Bert, had settled, full of people who looked like me. And anyway, I wasn't like other anak araw. My mother stayed away from the sun when she was pregnant, but craved sweet corn, and so that was how I must have ended up with corn silk hair and fair skin. Though I did burn in the sun, I wasn't near blind like I was supposed to be, only nearsighted, which was lucky since I wouldn't have known what to do with myself if I couldn't read. As our bus sped across the highway through an endless series of rice paddies, which I perceived as patches of yellowish brown, since it was April and the fields had been harvested, my grandmother assured me that I was meant for a better future than her and our ancestors, farmers who had tilled soil in the fields surrounding our village for generations. This is because you're fair and beautiful, she said, not dark and ugly like me. And this is sort of a trend in my early childhood that that albino kids in the Philippines, because of the history of American colonialism there, were often valued for being light-skinned, unlike in other parts of the world where, where albinos aren't necessarily treated in the same way, and can actually be subject to persecution, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to share yeah, Raheem, if you can enable my screen sharing, that would be great.
Yes, I made you a co-host.
Fantastic, thank you. So I just wanted to give everybody, let me go into slideshow mode. Just a sense of what I'm talking about, right? In terms of, this is my extended family. I'm not gonna name everybody, but basically I am with my cousins and uncles and aunts, and my brother is, kind of like in the bottom, near the bottom left, third from the bottom left. And my grandmother is holding the baby on the very left. I was raised by my grandparents. My parents had me when I was very young. And you can see, and I know, I'm not sure exactly what I was feeling at that moment. I obviously was not completely happy. I do know that I definitely had a lot of feelings of alienation as a kid, growing up in this environment where I was the only light-skinned person. I couldn't play outside. I don't think I got access to sunblock until I was 9 or 10 years old. So I just didn't go out. And yeah, so, this gives you a sense of the environment the rural Filipino environment that I grew up in, that a lot of people can't picture when they meet me in America. And this is a picture when I was a kid. I got invited to be a ring bearer a lot, or be a part of weddings, because they thought it was cool to have the sun child at their wedding. So I was part of a lot of formal occasions. And so this was one of them. And I thought it was really interesting, actually, that they gave me white pants, whereas all of the other dark-skinned kids had dark pants. And then one of the stranger things that happened to me in my life is that I subsequently became a child star in the Philippines. My mom, who is standing behind me with her hand on my shoulder, just randomly decided to bring me to an audition for a sitcom starring a famous comedian in the Philippines who was albino, Redford White, who is on the very left of the photograph. And so I actually ended up being the kid in a kind of Full House or Cosby Show type sitcom for several years as a child. So I just, so that was the life that I led. And this is another picture from that period. And if you read the book, you'll see that I found that period of my life really ambivalent and really difficult, because I think even then I had a very clear sense that I wanted to do things that utilize my talents and not just the way that I looked. I was very, I had this sort of very paradoxical personality where I wanted attention, but at the same time, I also didn't feel like people understood me or people really saw who I was. They only saw my skin and my hair. And I think acting really magnified that feeling, so that then when the sitcom ended, I actually got cast in the most popular soap opera in the Philippines at the time. And I decided that I didn't want to do it. And I escaped to my grandmother's in the provinces, and refused to, pretty much like refused to act again. I made a couple of appearances after that. And, you know, and I really haven't looked back. You know, I'm very content with the type of life that I lead now, teaching and writing. And it's really, you know, it's really what I feel like I'm meant to do with my life. Even though it was kind of fun for a while to be on TV and to, you know, and for people, you know, for strangers to know who I was. And then I wanted to show these slides to give people a sense of what queerness is like in the Philippines. So in the Philippines, you know, I grew up in the 80s, and I feel like if I had grown up in America, I would not have been exposed to queer, but also, and absolutely certainly gender nonconforming people as a kid. Whereas in the Philippines, gender nonconformity is really normal. It's still stigmatized in some ways, but you know, but it's very common for Filipino kids, you know, who were queer to dress up in women's clothes, or you know, the queer gay beauty pageants are a staple of Filipino festivals. Every town in the Philippines pretty much has a festival every year, and usually there's a gay beauty pageant, right? So so gender nonconforming people in the Philippines have traditional roles as entertainers and as comedians. And that's something that I was very much exposed to as a kid. I wasn't necessarily attracted to this culture because I perceived myself, this is a still from a movie actually, which I highly recommend, called The Blossoming of Maximo Oliveros, if you're interested in, you know, in learning more about that aspect of Filipino culture. And I think I wasn't particularly attracted to dressing up like this or being openly queer when I was a kid, just because I pictured myself as a serious and studious person. And I felt like, you know, like the kids who were doing the gay beauty pageants, et cetera, weren't, you know, like weren't serious, like weren't, you know, like weren't, I would spend most of my time reading, et cetera, right? And so even though I knew internally that I was queer, I was also struggling with my role in Filipino society. But at the same time, I never really perceived being queer and being gender nonconforming as in any way like fundamentally bad. As a kid, I just perceived it as not being particularly for me. Right? And then I also just, you know, because this, you know, like I'm giving this talk in a context where we're talking about the gay rights movement and Stonewall. I just wanted to give people a sense of the difference between the social movements in America that I would have been exposed to had I grown up in America versus what I was exposed to because of the fact that I grew up in the Philippines. So in the 80s, as many of you know, I'm sure, in America was the AIDS crisis and all of the activism around the AIDS crisis, particularly the work of ACT UP. And I think it would have probably been inevitable that I would have been at least exposed to and knew about ACT UP if I was growing up in the Philippines. I mean, if I had grown up in the States. But in the Philippines, because I grew up in the Philippines, the seminal event for Filipinos political event for Filipinos in the 80s was the People Power Revolution in 1986, which overthrew the dictatorship, the 20-year dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos. And so, so we had a dictator for 20 years who declared martial law, who very much shut down the press. There were all of these human rights violations, political killings, plunder, and millions of people went into the streets to overthrow him. And so he actually ended up in exile in Hawaii as a result. And so, I feel like my political consciousness and the way that I was inculcated into a political consciousness was very different, because I think had I grown up in the States, I wouldn't have necessarily felt, comfortable or open enough to be able to be actively political as a kid in the 80s. I would have just, seen act up from afar as a closeted queer kid. Whereas, as a Filipino person, I became really activated and became very much, very much inculcated into, a stance of activism as a result of the People Power Revolution. And then I am going to jump. This is a big jump. So it's funny because I'm going to have my 25th college reunion in June at Harvard. And actually they sent me this picture recently to ask whether I would feel comfortable putting it in the in the reunion book because of the fact that it's a pre-transition picture. And it's really interesting, one of the distinct facets of my identity as somebody who grew up in the Philippines is that I'm not uncomfortable with the idea that I used to be a boy and I had grown up as a boy and had lived, albeit briefly, as a young man. And this was my freshman year college picture. I don't actually have a lot of pictures from undergrad, but this happens to be one of them. And and that period of my life it was a really, really huge culture shock, being in that elite environment. We moved to Chino, California. I was in Chino, California for high school, working class, very, poor public school, right? And so in a lot of ways, coming into such an elite institution was even more of a culture shock for me in a lot of ways than coming from the Philippines to the US. But I feel like over the course of those 4 years, obviously, it's just inevitable that that the years that you're in college are going to shape you and are going to change you. And I think it was during those 4 years that I really found myself, first of all, I came out as a gay man at the time, and then ended up, exploring my gender, figuring out who I was. And by the end of that time, I thought of myself as a person who lived between genders. I didn't have language for it at the time, but that was what I felt. And that was what I actually told people, that I'm not bound or tied to being a man or a woman. And I think slowly but surely my my style, I started growing out my hair. I started wearing more androgynous clothing. I did a performance piece at the end of my senior year of college, which if you read the book, like I talk about a lot in terms of exploring my gender, et cetera, et cetera. And then shortly after college, I just ended up, like fully immersing myself in this idea of me as a woman. This started out actually as an art project. I was at the time really interested in photography. And so I asked friends to take pictures of me. And it started out as me exploring what it would be like to live in the world as a woman, right? And like over time that evolved such that it became not an art experiment. The art experiment became life itself, right? And I ended up, choosing to transition. But these are some early pictures. Like I got super dressed up for an event. This was an opening at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, and I think what's really interesting is that I feel like I entered into a sort of consciousness or a space of femininity and womanhood through a visual standpoint. But now my perception and my appreciation of my womanhood isn't really particularly visual anymore. And actually, in a lot of ways, I still, in a lot of ways, look very much, like when I typically don't wear makeup these days. And, I pretty much look like the same person as I did, when I was living as a man. But the difference is the way that I inhabit my body. The difference is the way that I orient myself towards people. And, I had to go through this period of really accentuating my femininity in order for me to feel comfortable being perceived as a woman, for my own sense of security, and also for me to really, emphasize that to other people. But over time, I've grown more and more comfortable with just being myself, who happens to be a woman, right? And the last part of this presentation, I'm just going to slide through a couple of, like over the years, I've written a lot of personal essays, many of which are touched on in the book. And I don't have pictures that represent them. So I just wanted to show you a few illustrations from those essays. This one was from a piece in the New York Times where I argued that trans parents should celebrate their trans kids' transitions rather than mourn them, because we're not actually dying, we're actually living the life that we want. And it depicts the person in the background is my father, who had a really difficult time with my transition. And we've had, like a really up and down relationship over, over my entire life, pretty much. But actually, the really funny thing was that, my dad and I were not in touch for several years. And it was actually the New York Times asking me to fact check this piece with my dad that allowed us to be in touch again, and has kind of like eased some of the walls between us. This is an image that is depicted of an experience that was depicted in the book, which was that I was the first openly trans person to appear in a production of the Vagina Monologues, which I did while I was working at MIT. in 2000 and I want to say 2001. And that was one of the experiences where being surrounded by women for 4 months, intensely discussing what womanhood was really kind of a turning point for me in terms of deciding to medically transition, because it was the point when I realized I was exposed to all of the hardships that women have to go through in the world, whether it's harassment, whether it's, all of the dangers of being a woman. This is, this is an illustration for a piece that I wrote about the first time that I experienced street harassment as a woman. And it was a really, for me, it was a real turning point that, like, even when I knew that there were all of these disadvantages to being a woman, I found myself still really, really, still very much wanting that experience and wanting to live the way that I live now. And this last illustration by the wonderful artist Bishak Som is for a piece where I talk about feeling like I'm feeling like immigrating from the Philippines to the United States has certain resonances for me to transitioning from boy to woman, and that it's important, just as it's important for me to maintain my Filipino identity, it's also important for me not to lose touch with all of the things that I learned living as a boy and as a young man, because I think this is a really different orientation from a lot of the ways that the trans people in the West tend to see themselves. Because in Filipino indigenous society, pre-colonial society, there were these figures called babaylan, who were third gender people who interceded between men and women, who were seen as shamans and priest figures, right? Because we hold knowledge that the people who've only lived as one gender don't have, and that idea and that sensibility and that consciousness is really important to me. And I really value and cherish the fact that I'm trans, and cherish the fact that I've had the myriad experiences that I've had. So I think I'm going to end on that note. And I haven't looked at the chat, but I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you. One second. Yeah, thank you, Meredith. First, thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you for your presentation. And I'm going to start some things off with a couple questions, and then we'll get into the audience Q&A. Does that work for you?
Absolutely.
All right, perfect. So in your book, you talk about your immigrant story, but you also talk about what it means to pass and navigating through those elite circles, different genders and everything. Can you talk about what you mean by accidental privilege and the need for fairness and opportunities, but also the trick of perception and the pressure to belong to different groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is that, like, you go into this elite college environment, and at least for me, when I entered Harvard, I had only been in the US for 3 years, right? And it became immediately clear that Asian people at Harvard at the time, I don't know what it's like in, now in the early 90s, especially within gay culture, were seen as aesthetically inferior. There were actually people who just didn't, they stopped talking to me as soon as they found out that I was Asian. And I think when you're 18 years old, that, I don't necessarily think that I had the most mature reaction, because I was just thinking about myself and how I can navigate through this, through all of the confusion of college and the social adjustment of being poor in this, extremely rich college. So I think, the way that I navigated through that was to not necessarily pretend that I was white in a really active way, but allow people to believe that I was white and to perceive me as white. And doing that certainly protected me from a lot of, like a lot of the ways in which people of color and Asian people are discriminated against, right? And I think, and I feel like now from from my vantage point, from my contemporary vantage point, I'm very aware of how toxic that was, and also ultimately self-destructive, right? Just because, I'm not white. So, so the fact was that even though I experienced a certain semblance of belonging, I was also incredibly, incredibly lonely, and was not, and did not have the support of the people who I actually belonged with, right? And that was a really difficult experience for me. And it was fortunate that I did have close people of color friends. And so at least I had, kind of like some safety valves as far as that was concerned, but it was still a very lonely experience, and, didn't need to be lonely in that way. But I think now I'm much more aware of the ways in which being perceived as white, being perceived as cisgender, which I often am, allows me to move through the world in ways that, like much more easily than people who are visibly BIPOC, and visibly trans, right? And I think, like when I talk about accidental privilege, that, it often manifests in ways that even as I take great pains to name my identities and to, and to, and as much as I try to not take advantage of my passing privilege, it's just unavoidable because of the fact that we live in a racist and transphobic society, right? And so simply by existing as myself means that I experience a measure of privilege that other people don't.
Yeah, and in the book you also talk about coming to the understanding that you want to be seen as your complete self. In the book you go through this complete journey, but can you talk to our audience about when did you discover your voice, your inner voice, but also your voice as a writer with coming up with this book?
Yeah, like I spent a long time not being publicly out as trans, like friends knew, but I spent 7 or 8 years being quiet about being trans because I knew that as soon as, as soon as I talked about being trans, then I was subject to, to the potential harassment and discrimination that trans people face. But I think ultimately I couldn't handle being isolated anymore and couldn't handle not being able to participate in the political movements that were happening. So in 2014, I just started writing op-eds about trans life, right? About aspects of trans identity. I did that for a number of different publications. And at the time, very, very few people were writing, especially for general publications, about trans life and trans issues, right? And so I think, and just sort of realizing that, you know, I'm way too educated, you know, like I have too many degrees, I love school too much, you know, like I have an MA in comparative literature, I have an MFA in fiction, I have an MFA in visual art, right? And I think it was the realization that there are not enough trans people talking about being trans and what being trans means that propelled me to just write about trans life. And then within, I mean, essentially, I wrote my first article about my first op-ed in April 2014. And by, you know, January 2015, I was a columnist in The Guardian, right? And then by August 2015, I was invited to be a staff writer at Buzzfeed. And from there, I started working on feature pieces, journalism, you know, like writing about other trans people's stories. And then at a certain point, I then thought to myself, well, you know, like I'm writing about all of these other people's stories, but I have my own, and my own is unique. No one else has my story. So that was when the idea to write the memoir came about.
Yeah. And let's actually talk about the book. How did you come up with the title Fairest? It fits when you read the book. It fits exactly what you're saying. But I'm interested. What is the significance of the title Fairest to you?
Yeah, that was actually it's so funny because I remember, you know, like I'm writing the proposal. I didn't have a title for the book, or one that I was satisfied with. And I hold myself up. This was between, I submitted the proposal in winter of 2017. And I literally hold up between Christmas and New Year's for like 3 or 4 days in a random hotel where like nobody knew me. I just like ran away from my family, who, you know, who's very tolerant about such things. Writers' families are the best. And I was just like, I need to come up with a title. And I think Fairest came up for me because it encapsulates both the idea of feminine beauty, but also how tied our perception of feminine beauty is to being light skinned, to being fair. And then also, you know, the book deals with the fairness of that, like how the justice of the ways in which we perceive both beauty and beauty, lightness and skin, fairness of skin. And so I just felt like as soon as I had that title, it's just like, okay, you know, like I understand this book, you know, and I actually was able to edit the book to the title, you know, like I was able to contain my experiences, you know, like in the context of the book.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because Ferris was actually released 2 months after the pandemic started, and I'm interested to see, like, you know, at this point, you know, we had all this unrest, but also more time than we ever had to kind of reflect and sit down. And you know I've read a bunch of books during this time. So what was the reception like in the Philippines and in the US of your book during this time?
Yeah, it was, I mean, it was very hard. You know, I think because there were so many things going on, right? And I think also because of the fact that it was published in the early part of the pandemic, people still didn't know, you know, like now we're used to the Zoom events, now like
Yeah.
you know, like we know what to do. But back then, you know, like everybody was scrambling, nobody knew what to do. and then and then the book launched, and then we were embroiled, rightly, justly, in the protests in the wake of George Floyd's death, and all of the then that entire aftermath. And I think what's really interesting is that it just put all of, for me at least, it put everything in perspective, because I think there's a lot of pressure for authors, to you want to sell the most books ever, right? And I think for me, having that experience really allowed me to situate the book for myself as something that I wrote in order for other people to appreciate and experience, however many people that is, right? And that the value that I experience as an author is so much more about how deeply people read the book, rather than how many people read the book. And that has certainly been really, really gratifying, both in terms of people many people who contacted me, many people that I've interacted with both online, and when the paperback was published, we were in that wonderful summer period where Omicron hadn't reared its ugly head yet, so I was actually able to do some in-person events. And also, the really thoughtful reviewers who wrote really wonderful, thoughtful reviews about the book. And it's really amazing how much you learn about your own work by reading other people, writing about it. And also really events like these, right? Like every time I talk about the book in a different context, I find myself learning about my own work and about my own perspectives.
Yeah. And you mentioned that once you discovered the title, you actually was able to edit the book to tailor to the title. But I'm interested to know that, was there something that you cut out the book that didn't fit because of the title, but that was really interesting that you really wanted to keep, but it just didn't fit?
Well, I wrote my entire high school, so if people have read the book, the basically it skips from me coming to America, and then the next part is 3 years later, when I'm in my first year at Harvard. And I wrote a section that's about, I think, like 70 pages, 75 pages, just about my high school, about my experiences in high school, but ended up feeling like they kind of diluted the impact of the book, right? Just because so many of the ways in which people treated me in high school were so similar to the way that people treated me in college, right? And so even though I feel like those experiences were important to relate in their own, like in their own way, or, like in their own right, I found myself feeling that they actually probably belonged in a different book, so maybe at some point I'll publish it as part of another book, or publish it as a long essay, something like that.
All right. Well, I have one more question before we transition to the audience Q&A.
Sure.
And I want to end it with this because in present day, you're this confident, intelligent person. And in the book, you talk about a lot of your insecurities and your upbringings and hardship. Can you talk about how did you deal with your insecurity and overcome it, or do you even overcome it? Or is it just something you manage better?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like I just feel like I'm always going to be a work in progress, for many reasons. I grew up in an extremely colorist society. As a light-skinned person, I was given a lot of privileges as a kid. I was a child star. So I just like basically for the first, whatever, like 14 or 15 years of my life, I just got whatever I wanted. And that's very difficult, to come to terms as an adult with realizing that, that the privilege that are granted to you are ones that disadvantage other people. And that if you're actually going to live an ethical life, it's important for you to recognize all of the ways in which the things that help you hurt others, right? And I think it's one thing to know that consciously, but it's another thing to actually live it out in the world, right? And I think when I'm at my most insecure and when I'm like at my most threatened, all of those old habits come out, right? Like I pull rank, I become an elitist snob, I just become a terrible person. And I think for me, it's just very important to just recognize and own that part of yourself, to give yourself some slack, but at the same time I think for me, it's a matter of consistently expecting more of myself, because of the fact that, especially as, my career has grown and, I've grown to have more influence, that has become, even more important, because I feel like now there are people who, who look at me and find, look at me as an example. And so it's very important for me to be really transparent about all of the ways in which I'm imperfect and will continue to be, even as I try to be a better person.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And so we're going to get into the audience portion of the program. And the first question is, hi, Meredith, can you share about your decision to write Ferris as a memoir instead of a collection of essays or another form?
Yeah. I wanted to write it as a memoir because I had written a bunch of essays. Like I've written, dozens of essays about trans life. I have used, like my intellect to the nth degree to just try to explain transness to people. I've written about everything from Caitlyn Jenner to Rachel Dolezal, if y'all remember, unfortunately, Rachel Dolezal. And like I've written about trans violence, I've written about sex work, I've written about trans call center workers in the Philippines. And so I felt like what I wanted out of the experience of writing Fairest was my interior perspective, like the thing that I wanted to be prominent was giving people a sense of how I perceive the world as somebody who can't be categorized in one way, right? And it's interesting because as much as my experience is unique and singular, I feel like increasingly so many people have this experience where they can't fit in the neat box that people expect them to fit in, right? So that if you're, like queer Asian people, people who have multiple identities that, that are in tension with each other and multiple experiences, right? And I wanted to give people a sense of that from inside rather than, and I felt like if I wrote it as an essay collection, then my kind of like academic leanings we're just gonna rear their ugly head and it'll just become mainly about ideas, right? And so I think that's why it took the form that it took. Thank you, Maggie, for the question.
And the next one is from Matthew. Was Harvard your college of choice? What did you study?
Oh, that's funny. That's a funny question, Matthew. I actually was not, well, first of all, I didn't even know that I could apply to Harvard or that, there was any chance that I would get in or that I could afford it. But thankfully I did well on my PSATs. And so they actually sent me and, they invited me to apply. And I was just like, oh, really? And what's the really funny thing was that the main reason why I applied to Ivy League schools was because my parents, well, my mom, my single mom at the time, wanted me to stay in California because she wanted me to help take care of my siblings. And I knew that the only way that she would allow me to leave California was to get accepted on a full scholarship to a really fancy school. And so that's what happened. So I don't know. I mean, yeah, I guess, yeah, I don't, I wanted to go to Berkeley actually. But but at the same time it felt like too close to my parents.
Yeah, I think that's the common theme with first generation kids. Your parents have high expectations because when they come into poverty or is difficult, they expect more from their children.
Right, it's a lot of pressure, right?
Yeah,
Because oh, this is the reason why we sacrifice this much was so that
exactly.
so that you can is so that you can have this life, right?
Someone has to do it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I majored in English literature. Predictably.
That's interesting because English isn't your first language. And
It
I
is
also
not. It is
and when
not.
I was studying for this, I also realized that you said you wrote Ferris by hand.
I did write Ferris by hand. That is
That
true.
that that is impressive. Like, what was that like?
It's just a normal part of my process. I actually wrote 2 full drafts of the book by hand before, before I put it on computer. And I do that because I like being able to work anywhere and I like being able to work, out in nature.
Like Guatemala?
And in
Yeah.
Guatemala, for instance, in Guatemala. And so I try actually as much as possible to keep it handwritten for as long as possible so that to maintain that. And I also just really like sort of the aesthetic, because for me, writing on computer feels like work. Whereas writing by hand, it just feels like, it feels like fun. I don't know, it's strange when people say that it's impressive that I wrote it by hand, because for me, it's just I love writing by hand.
Yeah, writing by hand it's a lost art in this digital age. So it is impressive because we don't have those muscles as we used to have them. It's
That's
not
true.
it's
That's
not
true.
a necessity now. So final question. The book is well received. You're an established writer now. Like you said, you're a scholar, you're academic. You're going to continue to learn and grow. So, what is next for you as a professional, as a person? What do you have on your bucket list now?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I just started. I forgot to apologize. This is my office at Sarah Lawrence, and it's completely bare because I just started teaching at Sarah Lawrence. So I recently joined the faculties of Sarah Lawrence and also the Antioch College low residency MFA program, where Maggie is actually one of my amazing students. And I love teaching, and I really, I didn't teach for several years just because I was working as an editor full time. And I definitely plan to continue to do it, and I'm very excited. One of my reasons for wanting to publish a book is to have the opportunity to teach more. So, so certainly that wish has been fulfilled. And I'm working on fiction right now, actually. I'm going back to my fiction roots because my MFA was actually in fiction. And so I'm writing a novel. And I can't really tell you much about it yet because I actually switched from notebooks to index cards recently. So it's all in
Wow.
index cards. But I'm starting to publish fiction. I'm publishing a couple of short stories this month, actually, one in the Boston Review, and another in an anthology called Anonymous Sex. So it's feeling like fiction right now, but I'm sure the pendulum is gonna. I unfortunately am that type of person. It's just like, oh, I just want to write everything. So I'm sure the pendulum is going to swing again towards nonfiction eventually.
Well, we look forward to it. I want to thank you again for joining us tonight. I want to thank you for participating in the series of programs for Rise Up. And I want to thank everyone in attendance. Thank you for supporting us. And please support. Please, if you haven't read Ferris, please go get it. There at the end of the program, there'll be a survey in the chat or when you close in the opening link. Please fill out the survey. We will love your feedback. Also, check out the website for our upcoming programs. And Meredith, do you have any last words?
I just, I am really appreciative of y'all for inviting me, and thank you so much to everybody who came to the talk. And and I'm hoping that someday I'll get to visit the museum and be able to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're welcome whenever you're ready.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Meredith, and thank you all in attendance. I hope you all have a great night, and I hope to see you at the next program. Right, see you.
Have a good night, everybody.